Welcome to the Allan Gray Speaker Series. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today. And I'm Kamar and Peter. I'm an associate professor at the Allan Gray Center for Values-Based Leadership at the GSB at UCT. And I'll be introducing and running a panel with both our authors today, Peter Willis and Gareth Morgan. I see a lot of familiar names in the chat greeting us. I just want to say welcome, one and all. It's great to have you here. I get to play act being in a podcast role, I think, being online. So it's a real pleasure for me to be here with you today. And the book that I'm going to introduce to you is called Becoming Good at Crisis, which is reversed in your screen. A field guide for leaders. And I think it's a very, very relevant topic for the times we're living in, because we're living in a time of high complexity, and one where you could argue that it's moving from complexity to chaos. And so all of us who are in positions where we've got to make decisions and navigate these uncertainties and crises in particular as they unfold, would be very interested in reading this book. I spent some time going through it. I didn't read it in detail, but I definitely covered all of it. And what struck me is how practical and how immediate it was for anyone who is in a leadership position. And I think that it's something you can pick up and from the first page, feel very much at ease with getting through the main messaging. It's not a difficult book to read by any stretch of the imagination, but it's an extremely useful one. So both our authors are here with us today, and we're going to have a little discussion about it. And I just would like to introduce them first. Peter Willis grew up in the UK and studied history at Oxford University. In 1993, after 15 years of working in London, he moved to Cape Town with his South African-born wife, who was returning from exile. In South Africa, he pioneered sustainability leadership development, and from 2002 to 2014 was African Director of the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. That's when I first encountered Peter Willis myself. Since 2014, he has been a freelance facilitator of innovative processes and strategic dialogues and a leadership mentor. He also trains people and whole teams in the art of facilitating breakthrough meetings and workshops. From 2019 to 2022, Peter was one of the founding fellows of the Institute for Strategic Risk Management. Gareth Morgan grew up in Durban, South Africa, where I grew up as well, in fact, just a few neighborhoods away. He studied political science at the University of Natal and then environmental change at Oxford University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. He was elected as a member of Parliament in the National Assembly of South Africa in 2004 and served there for 9 years. His legislative focus areas included water and environmental affairs. For the last decade, he has been a senior official at the City of Cape Town Metropolitan Government and is currently the Executive Director of Future Planning and Resilience. He was part of the leadership team that developed the strategic responses of the city to the Day Zero drought and the COVID-19 pandemic. He's a Tutu Fellow and an Aspen Global Leadership Fellow. He was recently appointed as a member of the Board of Directors of the Resilient Cities Network. So we have two people here who have been dealing with some of the most pressing issues of our time, and not just theoretically, but in the real world of practice. So welcome, Peter and Gareth. It's great to have you here with us.
Well, thank you for having us. It's really, really great to join you and everyone online today. Indeed, I think a very relevant topic in this complex world we're living in.
Yeah, me too. I also live in this complex world. We share Cape Town. Cape Town has some mitigating factors to its complexity too. So lovely to be here.
Well, welcome to both of you, and I'm sure we'll have a nice, rich discussion. I thought we'd start out just by each of you sharing your background and how you came to partner on the book and what you've learned from each other during this collaboration. And I'd like to go to yourself, Peter, first, and then Gareth.
What an interesting question. Well, the background, I'm just going to start with the background that sort of tilted me into Gareth's orbit, which was the extraordinary drought that we went through here in Cape Town, 2016 through to 18. And as we neared the crisis point and the sort of peak of the drought in early 2018, I, like everybody else in Cape Town, was getting really worried because the possibility of things going hideously wrong and us running out of water seemed to be becoming more and more real. And I had this sudden realization that everybody was adapting to this crisis. And that meant the government, businesses I knew, householders, and I suddenly realized that there was no institutional method to capture these learnings and adaptations. And I know there were going to be other cities who would go through this same thing in the coming years. And we ourselves in Cape Town needed to remember what we learned, because this is not going to be the last drought that we have to go through. So long story short, I got together with a documentary filmmaker friend, and we decided to interview people who had been involved in responding to the drought in the different sectors. We ended up with 39 people. And Gareth was my he opened the door for me to get into the city's leadership, to persuade them to come and be interviewed by me, for which I was eternally grateful. And that started our many conversations. We found that we had a shared interest in this question of how do you lead in a hideously difficult crisis. And then obviously COVID followed and our conversations continued. And then we sat down at breakfast. We used to meet for breakfast sort of every 6 months. And Gareth said, I think we should write a book about this. And not knowing what on earth I was saying, I said yes. And you ask was your question, what did you learn from the process of collaborating on the book? Sorry,
I said, what did you learn from each other during your collaboration?
Okay, well, gosh, I mean, there are two things. The things that I learned about what it's like leading inside a very well organized, highly high-performing city administration like Cape Town is fortunate to have. I got a lot of insights into the kind of dilemmas and challenges that Gareth and his senior colleagues had faced during these two big crises, and also now, ongoing. And I found that very sobering in a way, and also very educational. But then on the more sort of personal level, we're very different personalities and we have different writing styles. And I was wondering how on earth we were going to he write one paragraph and I write it. But actually, we just used common sense, and there was a lot of generosity involved. And it actually turned into a very pleasurable, productive experience. And we would meet for tea every couple of weeks at a particular spot in Tokai, which is sort of halfway between where we live, and thrash things out. I'll leave it to
yeah, it's a very well written book. It's very easy to read. It's not something that you struggle to get through from one paragraph to another. It's very easy flowing. So it doesn't show at all that you had very different writing styles.
No, but I think what we shared, fortunately, is that neither of us aspires to be an academic or to make an impression on the academy. So we decided minimize the references. We're not trying to prove any theory here. We just wanted to make it a personal conversation with leaders and aspirational leaders.
Oh, it works very well. Gareth, can you tell us a little bit? When we last met and we chatted about you meeting Peter, you couldn't quite recall exactly where you didn't first meet him. So if you can reflect just a bit on, how you got together, and what have you learned from Peter through this whole process?
I can't remember how Peter came into my space, but I can picture the moment. And it was, at a Seattle coffee. I remember the conversation very, very well. And Peter, accounted for what happened there very, very accurately. I was also interested in learning and had been deep involved in the leadership structures of the Day Zero drought. And I was there was lots of reasons why I was anxious during the drought, but I was actually also anxious that things were moving so quickly. It was a highly adaptable space, and I was worried that lessons were being lost. I was never interested in a single story of that event, and our book that Peter and I have written is not about those two events. As you know, it's about leadership lessons that we've taken from them. But I was intrigued by Peter, who wanted to put work into interviewing 39 different people for an hour and a half each. So Peter taught me a lot about reflection, and I must be fair, and I do reflect on it in the book. There were other collaborators along the way. Dr. Gina Zeervogel from the University of Cape Town's African Climate Development Institute was the first person to knock on my door and say, let's also start capturing lessons. And so I had been for a while. But Peter really put a huge amount of effort into that, and I helped him along the way, as he said, open some of those doors. And it's true, we had many coffees along the way, and I think we enjoyed the space where we could talk about leadership. And I'm really fascinated by the journey of leadership in any organization, and I constantly try and be better in that space myself. And yes, I said to Peter one day, let's write a book. And not that we translated that immediately. I think I'd been saying that for a year or so. And ultimately we did. We got through COVID. I noticed many of the patterns in response were very, very similar. And Peter has been incredible to work with. We have brought different skills to this project. Peter has lent in really, really hard around the leadership of the self and thinking deeply. He brings immense experience from working with leaders over a very, very long time. And he knocked much of my writing into shape. It must be fair to say. Not that we didn't have very different styles, but we both agreed we wanted a snappy book. Peter was a bit better at that than me. And after meeting for many coffees over many, many months, in Takai, we had a manuscript. And Peter did a lot of the project management, and I'm very appreciative to him. But it's a genuine collaborative effort, and every time I pick up the work, I can see both of us inside that book.
Thanks, Gareth. I just want to ask you, just for our audience's benefit, because I had the benefit of having a chat with you at my home last week, and I just wanted to get a better sense for where you are in the city and what you do in the city, just to position your real kind of role as a practitioner dealing with very real world eventualities.
Thank you for the question. So I have the privilege of being the Executive Director for Future Planning and Resilience, which is a directorate that is only about 3.5 years old. It was created after the beginning of the current term of political office. It would be fair to say that both Day Zero and COVID were events that were probably the reason why we got the political approval to start this directorate. And at a high level, this directorate leads the whole organization, works collaboratively with them on thinking about planning over the short, medium, and increasingly long term, beyond 20 years, in line with the broader strategies of the city. But at the same time, we are tasked with scanning the horizon for those weak signals that might show disruption. And we are essentially the surge capacity for if things go fundamentally wrong, like a Day Zero or a COVID. So I have the privilege of leading a remarkable group of people that includes a very large number of advanced project and program managers, industrial engineers, data scientists, and data engineers. And we have lots of regular work we support the business on, including business improvement, data analytics. We run all the corporate communications. But together, we are a very, very impactful group of professionals in the city of Cape Town. And we think very deeply about the changing nature of the world, whether it be the technological changes or demographic changes or climatic changes. And we seek to mainstream those prompts into planning. So not to treat everything as an exception, but to think very deeply about actually inculcating it into the medium and long-term responses of the city.
Thanks for that, Gareth. One of the things you mentioned, the benefits you gained from Peter, is around the self. And one of the first things I encountered in the book was, which resonated with a few other practitioners that I had in a class just 2 weeks ago, where they said, you've got to know yourself. So in the biblical sense, know thyself seems to be the primary mantra of leadership. And please share what you've learned about knowing oneself, whether personally or through interactions with other leaders. And I'll start with Peter here, because you've done a fair amount of interviews. What can you share with us about leaders' journeys in terms of knowing oneself?
Well, before I answer that question, Kamaran, I just want to say something. The most obvious thing I didn't say about what I learned from Gareth is that Gareth, unlike me, is a leader in a large organization. So he actually does this stuff that we write about. I've always been outside large organizations, advising, helping, and teaching, and so on. And so I think that's what gives our book real authenticity, to call it a field guide for leaders, when one of us is actually doing that stuff on a daily basis, for me felt really important. And I think he's probably, from what I can tell, a really good leader too. So the self, I mean, my understanding of, let's just stick to crises. My understanding of what it's like to be in a crisis is that one of the things you want most in a crisis is to be able to look up to somebody who has real authority and control of resources and has to make decisions that will affect you, and to look at them and say, this is a person I'm willing to trust. Because if you look at them and you think, I don't think they know what they're doing, or they're crooked, or they've got another agenda, then you really have no basis on which to feel you can relax, mobilize your own energies and move forward and so on. So what gives people the ability to trust a leader, in my view, is a sense that this leader is a grown-up. And by grown-up, I mean that this is someone who has moved through enough of life's developmental stages and absorbed their own learnings from various challenges, maybe traumas, difficulties, and so on, to get to the point where they have some wisdom. I mean, these are very common or garden terms I'm using, but that's deliberate because I don't think leadership is a mysterious, complex thing that you can only learn in an MBA program. We know when we're in the presence of a good leader who we can trust. They may have flaws, sure, everybody does. But there's something about a leader who knows that they're a leader. That's the other thing. You've got to have, a lot of people have no interest in being a leader. That's not what they're here for. They're not drawn to it. But then I've known many, many people who it's very obvious that they love the challenge of leadership. So when I'm in a crisis, I want to look to that sort of level of authority and decision making and see that this is somebody who loves their job, who really wants to be a leader, isn't trying to dodge the bullet and get out of it, and is psychologically and emotionally enough of a grown-up that they're not going to do things to cover up what's really going on inside them. Because, of course, the most obvious thing to say about a crisis is that it is stressful. And Gareth and I talked quite a lot about this as we were writing the book, the immense stress that is placed on people in leadership positions during these two crises we discussed in the book. To me, as someone who is not a natural organizational leader, I am in awe of what these people did. And interviewing some of the leaders for the drought project, so the drought was well over by the time we got them into studio. One of the most common things they said was how in the weeks and months after the drought was sort of seen off, they fell badly ill and they were really out of it for weeks in some cases. And I thought that is simply a measure of how unbelievably stressful it is. So with that degree of stress, you want your leader to be someone who's pretty robust in their knowing who they are. And yeah, I'll stop there.
I took note of the announcing the end of the crisis so that people can internalize that and move on and get out of a kind of state of high anxiety. You used a different set of words for it in the book. And it was actually comforting to me because as we came out of COVID and my own journey, I developed, I can't remember the name of the disease, but it was one of those, what's it called? It's related to chicken pox, where you get these really painful things all over your body. And it's purely stress related, is what my doctor said to me. And I was out of the loop for a while. I also came down crashing pretty hard. Gareth, I want to pose the same question to you. This whole notion of know thyself as a leader. I was struck in our discussion by the faith you had in the people around you and how highly you spoke of them. So it struck me that it wasn't just your leadership or the leadership team around you, but also a sense that there was a leadership culture around you which you could trust. So can you reflect a little bit about that, from your experience, your personal, as well as the people that you work with?
Yes. So I think one of the most important things that a leader in crisis can do is to provide clarity, a sense of interpretation of what's going on. And it doesn't have to be that they know everything. They almost certainly don't know everything. I think one of the aspects of crisis is that new information is emerging very, very regularly. But the ability to interpret, the ability to plot the initial course, and to own that crisis. And we deal with that in one of the stages of the crisis. But people look to that because otherwise an organization can be spinning its wheels, wondering, is this the moment? Is it a crisis? So that clarity is very, very important. And I accept with that comes some degree of risk. And the leader has to take that risk on because it might be, in some cases, that crisis isn't quite what you expected. It in other words, wasn't a crisis. But you can get that wrong, and it is worth thinking that through very, very much. But I think looking for clarity is so important. And there is comfort in the team. The leader, in this particular moment, or at least once they've articulated and got some of the aspects around interpreting the crisis down, then they have to think about who is the core that will co-lead in this particular moment. And I do live in awe of many of the people that I had the privilege of working with during day zero and the COVID-19 pandemic. And my sense, and we write about it in the book, is that it is so important for the leader as well to break the organogram, if necessary, quite frankly, because there's a regular mission of the organization, whether it be a business or a government. It's the reason they exist in the first place. And in some respects, that business has to continue because we're talking about the continuity here. But not everyone in, say, a regular leadership team, a C-suite, or however else an organization may structure itself, is necessarily the right group of people to lead in a crisis. And so it's a hard conversation for a leader to have. A leader will need to have the guts to be able to say, John or Peter or Sally, you're not the right people for this moment. Go about, the regular work, and I need to pick X, Y, and Z from other parts of the organization, because it takes a particular type of person to form part of a leadership team. The reason I answer the question in this way is that because there is so much uncertainty, and although you will try and reduce that uncertainty over time, and because at times it could feel chaotic, it is important to be in a space where you look around you and say, these are people who together are going to navigate the space. The leader and the team, hopefully everyone leaders in their own right. Because when things get tough, and things are often very, very tough, looking around you and having people going through very similar experiences, have the same level of possibly information that is available, can be very, very comforting. And neither of those two events was I the actual leader of the top team. I was in the first level of leadership of each of those teams, and I had the privilege of being able to observe, up one level up and around me, and then down. And so much of what I learned, which I've, Peter and I have put in the book, is around that and the positioning of the leader around and what is around the leader. All of that brings some degree of comfort in crisis.
If I might ask, yes.
Can I just chip in with a little anecdote there? I'm not sure if it made it into the book in the end, but one of the very senior leaders that I was interviewing during COVID, an American CEO of a big, big multinational, extraordinary woman. And she was telling me, as COVID was unfolding, I was interviewing her every week for half an hour. And one day she told me that she had come to the point where she needed to discard, exactly like Gareth is saying, discard one or two members of her normal executive team and bring in one or two people slightly more junior who she felt were exactly the right kind of temperament and skill set that she was going to need if they were going to manage this COVID thing. And she was winding herself up to this meeting where she was going to have to turn to one of her most senior deputies, a guy who'd been in the business for many years, and say, I'm sorry, just like Gareth said, I'm sorry, I'm going to ask you to keep managing your thing, do it really well, but I don't need you in my crisis leadership team. And he beat her to it. And he said, I'm not liking the way things are going in this thing. It doesn't feel like me. And she realized that she had started to communicate an aura of, this is how we are going to respond to this. And it's going to be very high pressure. I'm going to be demanding a lot of you, and things will change very fast. And he beat her to it by saying, that's not me. I'll do whatever else you want, but I'm out. And I thought that was a nice template to aim for.
Shows some degree of awareness on his part as well.
Yes,
which is
absolutely.
great.
No, I find myself respecting him.
Yes. Thanks for that. I want to go a bit more into sort of, I know it's all important, so I don't want to say the meat and bones of the book, but just in terms of the practical frameworks that you lay out, you have you explain 4 phases of crisis and 6 key capabilities that are central to it. So I'm going to just ask Peter to continue in that vein. Just explain to the audience, what are the 4 phases of crisis and what are the 6 capabilities? And then perhaps Gareth, if you could enrich that with some examples, either along the way or after Peter's explained.
This is beginning to sound like we've written a leadership book, isn't it? 4 phases and then the 6.
Well, at least it's not 10 traits of good leaders.
Make sure you remember them. Exactly. So at least it's not 10. We try to keep it manageable. So the 4 phases, I think they're really spot on, actually. I'm really proud that we nailed these and kept them really simple. The first one is before the next crisis, peacetime, as we refer to it. And that's hopefully a long period during which you can prepare for the next thing that comes, and you will never know what the next crisis is, which is something to bear in mind. So there's that. There's then what we call the breaking wave, when suddenly you realize, things are absolutely, there is no more normal. We are entering into a crisis, as Gareth is saying. There comes a moment when the leader has to say, okay, from now on, we are in a major crisis. Things are going to change around here. And Then there's what can be a short or very long period, which we call the turbulence, when the crisis is simply working itself out and you have to keep riding this thing. There's no letting up, which is why it's so incredibly exhausting if it does go on for many months or a year or two in our case. And then finally, there's what we call sort of recovery and learning, which I think speaks for itself. So those are the 4 phases, and then the 6 capabilities that we think you should put a lot of leadership thought and energy and resources into building so that you're ready when the crisis arrives are, let me see if I can get this off, ICT,
infrastructure.
So just, I mean, COVID taught us that if you don't know how to talk to each other electronically, good luck. Then there's data management. This is something that I think Cape Town has really got some wonderful stories on how if you know how to gather data that tells you exactly what is going on, you can manage better, you can lead better. Otherwise, you're in the dark. So ICT, data management, then having an adaptable supply chain, because your supply chain in any major crisis is almost certain to be disrupted. Where do you go for your essential supplies? Project execution. And Gareth told us just now that he's surrounded by amazing project managers and project execution specialists and so on. And I've learned from his stories that is absolutely critical. And then lastly, the 2 communication skills and protocols. How do we as an organization, what's our culture of communication with our stakeholders? That has to be pre-thought, can't make that up suddenly. And lastly, and this definitely has to be pre-thought, is partnerships. You need to be surrounded by friendly institutions, people who trust you, people you trust, just in the ordinary course of things, so that when there's a crisis, you're surrounded by friends. That's the 6 capabilities.
Do you want to reflect a bit on, in practice, how this unfolded in the 2 major crises that the city faced that you account for, which is the drought and then the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, so thank you for that opportunity. So, I mean, we also tell a little story which is useful, I think, for explaining maybe why we decided to focus on capabilities and then the phases of crisis, was that we were very good about internally documenting the response to the Day Zero drought crisis, which is a good behavior of project management anyway. And when the weak early signals of COVID started, in early 2020, we actually started by going back and reviewing the lessons learned from the drought. And a lot of our book is really about being agnostic about the actual crisis that the leader is necessarily going to respond to in their leadership journey, and thinking about some of the commonalities. And these capabilities are the capabilities that I saw come through very, very strongly, and what the leader reached for in the moment of first deciding whether the crisis was real or not, and then owning it, and then setting up the appropriate response. So, one or two, stories from that. I think in a project execution is really the secret power here. The ability to be able to have people around you who themselves don't have to be experts on any particular crisis. They're just very good at turning a strategy into a project, which then lands on the ground in some form or another. I think of a really good example from COVID was, you'll all recall that during social distancing, there was obviously a thinning out of the number of people that could be in any particular facility at any point in time. And the regular business of the clinics in Cape Town was to, provide family planning and HIV counseling and testing and provision of chronic medication, all very, very important. We couldn't afford to have a crisis in primary health as an impact of COVID. But at the same time, there was, COVID needed to be tested for. And so you had an overwhelming of the primary healthcare system. And the City of Cape Town only runs clinics. It has no role in hospitals and tertiary, secondary parts of that particular ecosystem. So, what to do? You don't have a lot of time on your hands, and you don't want the backlog of TB cases and testing for various chronic diseases to grow. And, having a team of project managers who probably didn't know anything about that system in January of 2020 were able to do 37 clinic extensions in a matter of 2 months, so that the regular business of primary healthcare could happen, as well as the particular requirements of the COVID response. And that was agile. It was, building on temporary facilities, retrofitting halls, that kind of stuff. And the ability for a leader to be able to say, this is what one of the most important things for us to do is. And as I said earlier, you want to, as far as possible, continue your regular business in crisis, but you're going to have to do it in a different way. So, that's one example. We talk a lot about project execution abilities. The data component, I think all leaders at the moment are having very, very detailed data conversations. Organizations, particularly in the age of AI capabilities, are checking their data and the ability of their data to flow. But data was important to both of those two crises. And the point we make about capabilities is you really want to work on your data system in peacetime, so that you have access to it for the purposes of adapting it in crisis. It's quite hard to develop a data ecosystem in your own business if you're already under significant pressure. But if one thinks of, for example, a day zero example, one of the things that was built rapidly during day zero, but could only have been built because the data was available, but in a different form, and the infrastructure that allowed it to flow and interact with other data sets was already available, was, for example, and it was controversial at the time, you'll recall it, for a period of time, the city put green dots on people's houses on maps, so that residents were able to see whether they were meeting their water goals or not. And inside of that system was some degree of peer pressure, because people on the road would look to see whether they or their neighbors had a green dot. And if you didn't have a green dot, it meant that you weren't saving enough water. But that was important because at the end of the day, 4 million Cape Townians saved Cape Town from disaster. But the ability to even have a conversation that says, I can move the data in a certain way, I can manipulate it, and I can use it for a way that can contribute to the most successful goal, which was drive down consumption, was, of course, very, very important. And as Peter said, those other capabilities, we learned a lot about supply chain vulnerabilities, I think, during COVID. It wasn't necessary that my own organization was ready for that. I don't think anyone was ready for it, but I've taken many lessons from that. The need for all of us as leaders to more regularly have a sort of a sense of the end-to-end view of our supply chains, and to stress test it more regularly, and to think more deeply about the appropriate near sourcing versus further sourcing. These are things we need to think about more as leaders. But the book, and I won't give it away, takes little vignettes from these two particular crises and gives some color to why these capabilities are important, and more importantly, why we should do everything possible to build their strength during peacetime so that they can be leveraged during crisis.
That's great. It goes some way already towards answering Albert's question. And just briefly, even though there's a lot of concerns over the ethics of how we use data, I think in that circumstance, it was used to create a sense of commons, in the neighborhoods. And we had a 6'3" guy going around checking up on everyone who was watering their gardens. So it kind of worked, There's something else I picked up on in the book, and I just want to turn, and it relates a bit to Albert Ferreira's question as well. But you spoke about, in the book, you speak about the limits of planning and the preparation paradox. And to me, that was complexity 101. So, Peter, if you could expand a bit on that, and Gareth, if you have anything to say about it as well, the limits of planning and the preparation paradox.
Ooh, was that in our book?
Yes.
It sounds vaguely familiar.
I can have a first go while Peter gathers his thoughts.
Gareth, this was a Gareth idea. I think you can tell from the expression on
and
my
you say
face.
You didn't write an academic book. I found an academic nugget in it.
I'll blame him. I'll blame him.
Look, I think Peter,
dig yourself out of this one.
I think Peter did a better job of naming my idea. I certainly didn't come up with the preparation paradox, but he was right, and it is eye-catching. I think what we mean by that is we've just spoken about these capabilities, and a lot of the book is at the front of the book really is saying we can't predict what that next crisis is going to be, and we reflect quite vulnerably, I think, around COVID, because it feels like the whole world was sort of caught off guard. COVID, it was true that COVID was sort of on the risk registers of the World Economic Forum, their big global risk report, but it wasn't there in the previous 5 years. And even if it was on the risk register of your own organization, no one could contemplate the secondary impacts of that crisis, because it was the non-pharmaceutical interventions that governments around the world chose to take to control that. And I think there's been a lot of reflection since then about whether, the effectiveness of it. But that's what people did. And I don't want to go into the detail of whether it was, in hindsight, good. It was all we knew at the time. But it was those secondary impacts that actually became the crisis for so many people. And obviously with, all due sympathy and respect for the many people who tragically passed away during that. But what I'm saying about that is, other than, I guess, actual healthcare systems and possibly labs and what, nobody was really tangibly preparing for an event like that. My own organization, which, by law has to have disaster management plans, and I think we have 24 disaster management plans for Cape Town, for disease and for chemical spillages and nuclear incident. There's just a certain type of crisis, particularly that type of crisis which is lingering and is around for a long time. Sometimes it arrives slowly and then sort of gathers momentum. My personal experience is that the best laid plans that have been put together often by really, really talented people, either in the risk space or the continuity space or in the disaster space, are not that useful when it comes to actually responding to these long, sticky crises that can often be around for weeks or months, in some cases, even more than a year. And COVID, of course, was probably 2 to 3 years in it. And that's kind of the limits of planning. There's a lot one can do for event-based planning and normal sort of continuity planning, whether it be a cyber attack and bringing that back online. It's much harder to think about something that is changing significantly over time. And that's why the book is really agnostic about what the next crisis is and leans so heavily on those capabilities and saying, if there's one thing the leader can do, whose regular job is keep the eye on the prize, which is the regular mission, is build the capabilities because they're actually good for your regular mission anyway. They're the types of things that are contributing to your profit or the public good if you're the government, or other good if you're an NGO. So it's really an invitation to leaders to actually think about crisis and say, look, my job isn't every day to think about the next crisis, but I can put a lot of the infrastructure in place that will be adaptable and at my fingertips. And I think that is something about what we meant by the limitations of planning and the preparation paradox being you can plan actually a hell of a lot, and it might be that you actually throw out that plan. Hopefully not. Hopefully it is useful, but rather have the capabilities at your fingertip and then the leadership and people around you so that you can rapidly build a response that is more appropriate to the fast-changing nature of that particular crisis.
It really goes into organization building. Sorry, Peter.
I was just saying, I told you he would know.
So this leads me to the next question, which, and you've alluded to it already, which is, attending to weak signals, which also has an inherent paradox in it because they're weak signals and you've got to assess them and you're not quite sure whether it's going to manifest into something. You go into this in the book, and you're not quite sure if the next disease is necessarily going to turn into a global pandemic. So there's something in that, in navigating that, which interested me. So what kind of sensitivities are required to be effective in attending to weak signals? And I have to admit, as someone who's very deep into complexity theory, I often lecture about the nonlinear effects coming from outside of what is normative. So they're very difficult to plan for. But you've got something here where you spoke about coping with those weak signals. Gareth, let me start with you, and then Peter, maybe if you can follow up.
Yeah, this is a very difficult, area of leadership because mistakes can be made in this particular space. If I think back to COVID, having learned many lessons from, for example, day zero, I actually was tasked in sort of February, a good 7 weeks before that lockdown period, to start working on what this could mean. It was before, the COVID had really burst into northern Italy and New York State and Spain, which is where it jumped most acutely after Wuhan. And so it was early days, and it was speculative in nature, the work that I was, asked to do. But, I was asked to think through what are the impacts of this. And it was a low cost, well, it didn't cost anything, but it was a low risk initiative to be able to put a few people into a room and to start getting the muscles going. And to start thinking quite early about what this could be. So that, for example, particularly if the crisis then escalated, and indeed it did escalate from probably around about mid-March, that there was already some people who had been thinking a bit more deeply about it. It didn't mean, it was interesting because in that particular crisis, someone else declared the crisis. The president got onto national television and declared a state of disaster. And so in that sense, that leadership moment was taken away from all of us as leaders of different organizations. But there was still a moment where the leader has to step up and say, okay, what are my responses? So they just didn't have to own it. But that's really, I think, a good behavior is to be curious about the weak early signals in the system. I recall, for example, last year with my team, getting the team around when monkeypox, or I should say mpox, more appropriate way to say it, mpox was finding footholds in various parts of the African continent. And because we're alert to what had happened during COVID, we got people to put together, we put some monitoring, but we didn't invest anything. We didn't say we're even near to a crisis, but we monitored it. And that was a useful behavior. So one can get this wrong. I think the best thing is for a leader to broadly remain aware and to possibly keep a kind of running list of these weak early signals that are being picked up. I think it's important for the leader to cast his or her net wider than their common metrics that they may be tracking on a quarterly or a weekly basis every now and again. And then to periodically brainstorm with the team. Am I seeing this correctly? What do you think about it? None of these are the moment of decision. None of them are. But the ability to just run them through and say, should we be doing anything more in this particular area? Should we send out scouts, to the horizon and to look a little bit further? It's not a perfect science, but it does give you an advantage, because if you can be an early mover in the crisis, you have the advantage of time, which probably means your adaptability is increased in that particular crisis.
There's something to do with early warning there and really having your feelers out, but not panicking too quickly. Peter, are there any thoughts you have to share on this, given your interview
Gareth's
series?
covered it very, very well. I think the only extra thing that occurs to me is the the advantage of having a network, you and your leadership team saying, do we know anybody in China who we could ring and ask? Like, what's your view of what's going on? Or in wherever it may be relevant to get another view, because we, in a global, highly complex, fast-moving world, one forgets just how most of the people you talk to on a daily basis are very, very limited and you share the same sort of worldview, most likely. So, and also something about the ego of the leader to say, because, you know, a cartoonish kind of leadership quality is to say, okay, I know what's going on here. This is what's going on now. You do this, you do this, you do that. And actually, those weak early signals are best handled by somebody who says, interesting, as Gareth says, curious. I don't know what's going on, but I bet there are some people who know more about what's going on than I do. Let's get them in a room or get them on the phone, etc.
That's just sage wisdom. In fact, my own experience mirrors that very, very closely. It was word of mouth from a public health expert who's a friend of my wife's, but it came through someone else, a mutual kind of friend, colleague, who said, this is coming. And this was about 2 weeks before the lockdown hit. And I immediately pulled my kids out of school and hunkered down because I was terrified, having gotten very ill towards the end of the year before COVID hit. And I'm convinced that that's exactly what I did get, because I ended up with asthma. And so I was really, really panicked about it. And I acted on that information because I knew I could trust it. This is from an expert. They know what they're talking about. We've got 5 minutes left, and I do want to get to, because both Dupont, the two questions we have, and from Dupont as well as from Albert, relate to, we have these existing systems, but, and I'm sure you'll be highly aware of this, Peter, as someone who's been in the sustainability space for a long time, is how do we repurpose those systems so that they are future ready in a sense? And this is a very difficult question to answer. I appreciate that it's not a straightforward thing. Just anecdotally, around 2010 or 11, I gave a presentation to the Development Bank of South Africa. And, I said, every house should be built with a rainwater harvesting tank, especially on the western half of the country, because we knew by then that it was going to dry. And even the city of Cape Town had been drying for decades, on average. And I was making the argument that we should have solar water heated geysers on every new house that's built. And, I might have gone a bit far with talking about eco-mobility at the time. But I basically got kind of laughed out the room because they said to me, you want us to have those things that people in the rural areas have? Like, what are you talking about? And so all those years later, I became highly aware that we weren't thinking about how to not necessarily just repurpose existing capabilities, but to build resilience into the system so that we have more degrees of flexibility, even in terms of strategic redundancies that we build into the system, to navigate this future that we know is coming, but we can't predict exactly when these effects are going to hit us, these climate change effects, for example.
So can I have
Yes, please.
A quick response, because it seems to me that both Albert and Dupont are asking a similar question, which you've articulated nicely, Kamaran, around, and I think Gareth gave us the clue a little earlier, that your ideal approach to building these 6 capabilities is not to see them as specialized investments that are waiting for a crisis, but these are ways to build the capacity of your organization with the optimum flexibility to be useful and adaptable when the unknowable crisis hits. And what you know about a major crisis is that everything about you becomes vulnerable. All your organization suddenly becomes, you don't know specifically which bits are going to become most vulnerable, but you want to be able to lean into certain fundamental strengths. Now, I think you can make a case for building those capabilities and investing the money in them, go to your DBSA story just now, Kumar, without having to paint a picture of exactly how useful they would be in a future climate challenged world, but just on the basis of cheapness, return on cap, you can make a now case for things that are going to prove to be invaluable later. So it's a rather selfless task building these capabilities, and you can't go around saying, we're going to be in a crisis. We've got to spend now, because people will run away.
That's a very, very good answer. Thanks, Peter. Yeah, Gareth, do you have any reflections on this?
So, not that we write about this in the book. I mean, I think the building of resilience, building resilience is not a goal in itself. I thought sustainability was always more of a goal. Resilience is really a practice or a capability, that allows an organization or a system to get back on track, either near to where it sort of veered off, sometimes I guess better than it previously was. And I mean, there are a number of ways I think organizations or broader systems can build resilience. And I think in our future, all of us should be thinking more broadly about, in our regular business, how are we building that strength, which is another way, I guess, of talking about resilience. So alternatively, how can we reduce vulnerability? And as an organization that I work for, the answers are still the most important things that people need. Not all of them are, build a desal plant or build a new hospital or something. Many ways that we build strength, that we need to build strength in society, that improve the ability to be responsive to whatever a shock event is, comes down to things like, making sure that more households have jobs in them, making sure that, people are not living in informal structures because they're obviously more secure, or alternatively, reducing crime. You can have many indicators of vulnerability in a society, but they actually come down to some leading indicators around jobs and crime and the type of living dwelling. Now, we don't deal with it in the book, but that is kind of regular business. And one doesn't need to even have a specific language about that. That's really just the requirements of our constitution, in order to transform the lives of people and to make sure that they're better. But the benefit of that, of course, is the ability to improve resilience to whatever whatever shock event may arise, and may strike a household or a community. Of course, I'm thinking very much like a government practitioner here. It might be different for other types of organizations.
Can I on the tail of that, Gareth, it strikes me that what you're describing there, if you can reduce crime, increase the number of people who have work, have stronger structures that people live in and so on, those are things that, if you're a city government, to go right back to the earlier part of our conversation where I was talking about trust and grown-ups and so on, my sense of living in Cape Town is that I live in a city that is by and large run by a grown-up set of people who have grown-up intentions for the city and have the ability to actually deliver on many of them, certainly not all, but it's so when, and that in itself is a preparation for being good in crises. That I know that when we have our next major crisis in Cape Town, the city administration will have earned itself a whole lot of trust, invisible trust, that I know other municipalities around this country will struggle to, they can't earn it once the crisis starts. It's very difficult to. It's good to go in with your bank balance, your sort of trust bank balance, reasonably full before, and it's things like dealing with the basics of city living without getting into fancy resilience policies and special actions.
Thanks. I see run out of time, but I think we can squeeze in a question or two from the audience if there are any. If there's anyone who's got a question you'd like to ask live, please indicate that you want to speak.
How do they do that? There might be
I'm not sure.
Yes. So there's a
just raise your hand.
Raise your hand. If you
Your
look,
virtual
you
hand.
click on react, and then that'll give you an option for raised hand and then different emojis.
Of course. So obvious.
Okay, I don't see any hands coming up at the moment. I see some laugh emoticons going up. It's kind of like the end of the lecture when I ask if anyone's got anything to say. Everyone's like, okay, I want to go have my supper now. I'll be lecturing in another half an hour for the rest of the night. No, I'm looking forward to it. It's a great class. I just want to say, one of the things that I've been emphasizing in my teaching recently, and I've really come to see the benefit of this, is the overlap between scholars and practitioners in leadership. And, there's a great paper called Don't Simplify, Complexify by Harry Tsukas, where he talks about how practitioners live life forward, whereas scholars understand backwards. But you have these moments of resonance when the two come together and the practitioners internalize what they've been doing in theoretical language, and the scholars ground their knowledge in the empirical, practical realities of what is transpiring in leadership. And I think encountering your book gave me one of those experiences, because it wasn't a 10 traits of good leaders. There's actually a lot of very good complexity thinking baked into it. And so it sparked a bunch of thoughts on my behalf, and I'll be in touch with you to interview you further to see if I can tease out some of those resonances together with you. I just want to say thank you to our guests today, everyone, and thank you for everyone who attended, for the questions we had I had 2 pages of questions, but I didn't go through all of them. Peter?
Can I just say, I see it's been put on the chat, where the website to go to if you are interested in acquiring a copy of our book, which we would love you to do. It'll change your life.
Please get the book. It's a very, very good read, and it's very straightforward. There's no
long
except
words.
for
we avoided long words, except for paradox.
The planning and preparation paradox, which is well explained in the book in any event. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kamaran. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for your time.
Enjoy the rest of the night.
Take care.